They demanded he leave his own son's award ceremony. "Sir, this area is for VIPs only," the event staffer said, her voice icy, pointing toward the exit. "Get out now, or security will escort you." James Harper, in his faded, shoulder-worn firefighter's jacket, stood still as stone. His hands gripped a handwritten note, blue ink smudged from countless rereads. "Dad, I want you front row." But 4 firefighters sat quietly in the 6th row. They knew who he was. And when they stood, a 20-year secret silenced the entire room. Welcome to Heart of Heroes, where stories of courage and gratitude come to life. Discover what really happened. The sun was just rising over the Boise, Idaho hills as Sarah Mitchell pulled into the convention center parking lot. Tonight was the Community Awards Gala, honoring young people like her son. The air buzzed with laughter, camera flashes, and glittering congratulatory signs. Sarah stepped into the auditorium, clutching a program with her son's name, Ethan Harper, listed as the Young Community Leader awardee. She picked a seat mid-row, wanting a clear view of the stage, but her eyes were drawn to a man. He didn't enter through the main doors like everyone else. He slipped in through a side entrance, quiet, like he didn't want to be noticed. His old firefighter's jacket, worn boots, and ramrod straight posture stood out amid the crowd fussing with ties and snapping photos. He was James Harper, but nobody in the room knew that. Not yet. James moved slowly, heading for the VIP section, where nameplates read, "Honored Guest." He paused at an empty chair. Then the staffer appeared, her name tag pressed tight against her chest. "Sir, this area isn't for you. Please leave." Her voice held no hesitation. James just nodded calm. "My son invited me," he said, holding up the note. She didn't look, just shook her head. "Your name's not on the list." 2 security guards approached, one resting a hand on James's shoulder. The crowd didn't notice, too caught up in bouquets and laughter. But Sarah noticed, and so did the 4 men in the 6th row. They said nothing, but their eyes locked on James, as if waiting for something no one saw coming. Nobody in the auditorium realized that moment would change everything. James Harper stood silent under the dim glow of the exit sign, his hands still clutching his son's invitation. The crowd kept laughing, cameras flashing, but Sarah Mitchell couldn't take her eyes off him. Something about this man, not anger, not sadness, but an invisible weight, like he carried a story nobody bothered to ask about. The event staffer, name tag pressed tight against her chest, brushed past James again, whispering to a colleague. "He's still standing there," she said, voice low. "I don't think he was invited. Let security handle it." Sarah felt her chest tighten, not from fear, but from a nameless shame, as if she were witnessing something wrong she couldn't name. The ceremony began. A warm voice boomed over the speakers, welcoming families, young leaders, and honored guests. Applause erupted, laughter following a quip about Idaho weather. But Sarah didn't laugh. She kept watching James, motionless, his eyes locked on the stage where his son, Ethan Harper, was about to be honored. The staffer passed by again, this time with a tall security guard. "Sir," he said, voice firm but polite, "I need you to leave. This is a restricted area." James didn't resist. He just shook his head slightly, voice low but steady. "My son invited me. I'm staying until I see him up there." The guard frowned, hand tightening on his radio. The crowd didn't notice, too busy with congratulatory signs and selfies. But the 4 men in the 6th row, retired firefighters, noticed. One of them, short hair, broad shoulders, whispered to the man beside him, "That's Jim. They don't know what they're doing." Then a young speaker took the stage, a guy in a crisp suit with a rehearsed smile. According to the program, he was the mayor's son, introducing the awards. He spoke with perfect pauses, thanking sponsors, thanking the Boise community. But then he added a line with a slight smirk. "And a special thanks to our VIPs in the front row, who represent Boise's true values, class and success." Polite laughter rippled through the room. But Sarah didn't laugh. James didn't laugh. Neither did the 4 men in the 6th row. One of them, Mike Donovan, tall with eyes sharp as knives, leaned forward. "That was aimed at Jim," he whispered. The others nodded, their gazes fixed on the man under the red exit sign's glow. Sarah turned to the woman beside her, another volunteer with a shiny name tag. "Who's that man?" she asked quietly. The woman shrugged, eyes glued to the program. "Probably some guy in the wrong section. These events always have stragglers. The word straggler hit Sarah like a knife. She looked at James again, really looked at him. The lines on his face, the salt and pepper hair, the faded but clean firefighter's jacket, like it was the best thing he owned. He wasn't there to make a scene. He was there for a promise, for a note, for his son. And then, the moment came. A second guard approached, taller, voice harder. "Sir, come with me now." His hand touched James's elbow, not hard, but enough to make him shift slightly. Sarah held her breath. The crowd was still caught up in the stage, but she knew, she felt, something was about to explode. James didn't fight back. He just pulled his arm free, slowly, and took a small, worn note from his pocket, its edges soft from countless touches. He held it up, not to argue, but as a reason. "My son wrote this," he said, voice so low it was almost a whisper. Sarah squinted, catching the handwritten blue ink. "Dad, I want you front row." But the staffer didn't care. "No guest pass, no seat," she snapped, voice sharp as a blade. "Sir, go now." James exhaled slow and stepped back. No resistance, no anger, just a quiet surrender that made Sarah's heart ache. She opened her mouth, about to say something, but didn't get the chance. A chair scraped against the floor, then another, then four more. From the sixth row, four men stood up in unison. They didn't shout, didn't draw eyes, but their movement made the auditorium hold its breath. Mike Donovan, the tallest, stepped forward first. He pulled an old badge from his pocket, glinting under the stage lights, a Boise Fire Department badge. He held it up, staring straight at the guard. "This man doesn't leave," he said, voice low but resonant, like a drum. "He's James Harper. He led us through fire, through smoke, through death. He stays." Murmurs spread through the crowd. A few heads turned, a few phones lowered. The staffer froze, her name tag trembling in her hand. Sarah felt her heart pound. She didn't know who James Harper was, but she knew, right then, the room was witnessing something bigger than any speech. Mike turned to the crowd, his voice slow but firm. 20 years ago, in the Boise Mall fire, James Harper ran into a collapsing building. He saved 8 lives, including 3 of us on his team. He got third-degree burns, lost part of a lung, but never asked for a thank you. He paused, his eyes sweeping the room. "And now you want to kick him out of his own son's ceremony?" His voice wasn't loud, but it hit like a punch. The auditorium fell silent, only the hum of overhead lights audible. The staffer stepped back, eyes wide. The guard let go of James, retreating. Sarah stood, not even realizing it, her hands clapping slowly, like she needed to break the stifling quiet. A few others joined, scattered, timid. Then, from the third row, an older woman stood. She wore a simple dress, her hands trembling, eyes red. "I'm Maggie Reynolds," she said, voice choked but clear. "I was the last person Jim Harper saved in that fire. He carried me out as the ceiling collapsed behind us. Without him, I wouldn't be here, and my son wouldn't have a mom." She pulled a creased photo from her purse, showing her and James in a hospital, his face half-bandaged. She held it up for the room to see. "You can't throw this man out." A stifled sob echoed somewhere. Sarah felt her eyes sting. She looked at James, still standing there, still quiet, his gaze on the floor like he didn't want the spotlight. But the real moment came from the stage. Ethan Harper, in his award robe, stepped out from the lineup, hands gripping the mic. He didn't look at the audience, didn't look at the award. He looked straight at his dad. "I'm here because of my father," he said, voice shaking but resolute. "Not for this award, but because he taught me heroes don't need the spotlight." He shed his robe, walked off the stage, and draped it over James's shoulders. "This is your award, Dad," he said, then hugged him tight. The auditorium went still, a sacred kind of quiet, like in churches or on battlefields. The 4 firefighters raised their hands in a slow, solemn salute. Mike Donovan stepped forward, pressing a Boise Fire Department commemorative coin into James's hand, engraved with "Courage burns brighter than fire." The whole auditorium rose to its feet. Applause started, slow, then roared like a wave. Sarah clapped, tears streaming down her face. The staffer bowed her head, slipping into the shadows. James didn't smile, didn't look up. He just opened the note one more time, read his son's words, then folded it, tucking it close to his heart. Because that was all he came for. Not the lights, not the glory, just a seat to see his son shine. The Boise Convention Center auditorium glowed with lights, but the corner where James Harper stood was cloaked in the shadow of the exit sign. He didn't move, didn't argue, just stood there, hands gripping his son Ethan's handwritten note. The smudged blue ink, "Dad, I want you front row," was a promise he couldn't break. Sarah Mitchell, seated mid-row, felt her heart race. She didn't know why, but James's steady gaze, his straight posture despite the worn firefighter's jacket, kept her eyes glued to him. Something was wrong, and she felt it like a cold breeze cutting through the ceremony's warm air. The event staffer, young, hair tied high, name tag pressed against her chest, approached again. "Sir," she said, voice sharp as a blade, "you're not on the list. Please move to the public area in the back." James looked at her, not with anger, but with a calm that made her pause for a second. He pulled a note from his pocket, holding it up slowly. "My son invited me to sit here," he said, voice low, steady, like a command from the heart. The staffer didn't bother looking. She shook her head, waving toward two tall security guards approaching. "No name, no seat," she snapped, then turned away, as if James were just a minor snag in her busy schedule. Sarah leaned over, whispering to the woman beside her, a volunteer with a forced smile. "That man doesn't look like a troublemaker," she said. The woman shrugged, eyes fixed on the program. "Probably someone who wasn't invited. Let security deal with it." The word "deal" made Sarah shudder. She glanced back at James, seeing a guard place a hand on his shoulder, not hard, but enough to make him shift slightly. "Sir, come with me," the guard said, voice firm, radio crackling. James didn't resist. He just shook his head, gently but firmly. "I'm not causing trouble. My son's up there. I'm staying." His words weren't loud, but they rang like a declaration, making Sarah's chest tighten. The crowd around them was caught up in congratulatory signs, bouquets, and camera flashes. They didn't see James, didn't see the injustice unfolding just a few yards away. But the four men in the sixth row, retired firefighters, now in plain button-up shirts, saw. They exchanged quick, sharp glances like men who'd faced fire and smoke together. One of them, Mike Donovan, tall, short-haired, whispered to the man beside him, "They don't know who Jim is, but they're about to." The others nodded, eyes locked on James, as if waiting for a signal, a moment to act. The ceremony rolled on. A deep voice boomed over the speakers, introducing Boise's young leaders. Applause erupted, mixed with laughter at the MC's joke about Idaho's fall weather. But Sarah heard none of it. She saw only James, standing silent under the faint red glow, his eyes fixed on the stage where Ethan was about to step up. The staffer passed by again, muttering to the second guard. "He still won't leave," she said, voice low but loud enough for Sarah to hear. "Call for backup if you have to." Sarah felt a surge of anger, not hers but the moment's. James hadn't done anything wrong. He just stood there, with his son's note, with the dignity of a man who'd run into flames to save lives. Then a young speaker took the stage, the mayor's son, in a sleek suit and a confident smile. He spoke of Boise's values, success, community. But then, with a slight smirk, he added a line. "A special thanks to our VIPs in the front row, who represent our class and success." Polite laughter rippled through the room. But Sarah didn't laugh. She saw James still standing, his gaze unwavering. And she saw the four firefighters in the sixth row, their faces hardening. Mike Donovan leaned forward, whispering, "That was aimed at Jim. They think he doesn't belong here." A teammate nodded, hand gripping the chair's armrest. Sarah's heart pounded harder. A mistake was being made, bigger than anyone in the room could imagine. The second guard, taller, stepped forward, his tone no longer polite. "Sir, I don't want to make a scene. Leave now." His hand gripped James's elbow, harder this time, making him step back half a pace. Sarah held her breath, her hands crushing the program until the paper crumpled. The crowd didn't notice, too busy with photos and applause. But she noticed, and the four firefighters noticed. James pulled his arm free, slowly, and held up the note again. "My son wrote this," he said, voice low, almost a whisper. "I'm not going anywhere." Sarah saw the blue handwriting, the note's edges soft from countless touches. But the staffer just shook her head. "No guest pass, no seat," she said, voice ice cold. "Get him out." Sarah opened her mouth, about to speak, but didn't get the chance. A chair scraped against the floor, then another, then four more. From his sixth row, the 4 firefighters stood in unison. They didn't shout, didn't raise hands, but their movement made the auditorium hold its breath. Mike Donovan stepped forward first, pulling an old Boise Fire Department badge from his pocket, glinting under the lights. He held it up, staring straight at the guard. "This man doesn't leave," he said, voice low but booming like thunder. "He's James Harper. He led us through fire, smoke, and death. He stays." Murmurs spread through the crowd. A few heads turned, a few phones lowered. The staffer froze, her name tag trembling in her hand. Sarah's heart thumped. She didn't know who James Harper was, but she knew, right then, the room was witnessing something sacred. Mike turned to the crowd, his voice slow but firm. 20 years ago, in the Boise Mall fire, James Harper ran into a collapsing building. He saved 8 lives, including 3 of us on his team. He got 3rd-degree burns, lost part of a lung, but never asked for glory. He paused, his eyes sweeping the room. "And now you want to kick him out of his own son's ceremony?" His voice wasn't loud, but it hit like an accusation. The auditorium fell silent, only the hum of overhead lights audible. The staffer stepped back, eyes wide. The guard let go of James, retreating. Sarah stood, her hands clapping slowly, like she needed to break the stifling quiet. A few others joined, scattered, hesitant. Then, from the 3rd row, an older woman stood. She wore a simple dress, her hands trembling, eyes red. "I'm Maggie Reynolds," she said, voice choked but clear. "I was the last person Jim Harper saved in that fire. He carried me out as the ceiling crashed down behind us. Without him, I wouldn't be here." She pulled a creased photo from her purse, showing her in James in hospital. She held it up for the room to see. "You can't throw this man out." Stifled sobs echoed. Sarah felt her eyes burn. She looked at James, still quiet, his gaze on the floor, like he didn't want the spotlight. The Boise Convention Center auditorium froze, as if time itself had stopped. James Harper stood silent under the faint red glow of the exit sign, hands clutching his son Ethan's handwritten note. The event staffer, her name tag trembling in her hand, had just ordered security to escort him out. A tall guard, gripping his radio tightly, stepped forward, voice hard as steel. "Sir, leave now, or we'll have to use force." Sarah Mitchell, seated mid-row, felt her heart clench. She looked at James, his eyes free of anger or fear. Only a deep resolve, like the fire that burned in him 20 years ago. The crowd was caught up in laughter and applause, but Sarah knew something monumental was coming. And then it hit, like lightning tearing through the night. 4 chairs scraped against the floor, sharp, in unison, like a wordless command. From a 6th row, 4 men stood, not rushed, not loud, but their presence made the auditorium hold its breath. The leader, Mike Donovan, tall, eyes sharp behind sunglasses, stepped out. He pulled an old Boise Fire Department badge from his pocket, glinting under the stage lights like an undeniable proclamation. He held it up, staring straight at the guard, voice low but ringing like a bell. "This man doesn't leave," he said. "He's James Harper. He's our hero." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, like wind over a dry field. A few heads turned, a few phones lowered. The staffer froze, mouth agape, her name tag hitting the floor with a soft clink. Sarah felt her chest tighten, not from fear, but from a sacred feeling rising within her. Mike Donovan didn't stop. He turned to the crowd, his gaze sweeping over stunned faces. 20 years ago, he began, voice slow but heavy as stone. In the Boise Mall fire, James Harper ran into a collapsing building. Flames devoured everything. Smoke so thick you couldn't see your own hand. But Jim didn't stop. He saved 8 lives, including 3 of us on his team. He paused, pointing to the 3 men behind him, retired firefighters with weathered faces, eyes locked on James. He got 3rd-degree burns, lost part of a lung, but never asked for a thank you, never bragged. And now you want to kick him out of his own son's ceremony. His words weren't loud, but they cut like a blade through the room's indifference. A heavy silence fell, broken only by the hum of overhead lights and someone's sharp breath near Sarah. The staffer stepped back, eyes wide, as if realizing she'd sparked a storm. The guard let go of James, retreating, his radio silent. Sarah stood, unaware her hands were clapping slowly, like she needed to shatter the stifling quiet. A few others joined, scattered, timid, like the first drops of rain before a storm. James stood still, eyes on the floor, note in hand. He didn't nod, didn't smile, as if a spotlight wasn't meant for him. But Sarah knew, and the room was starting to see, that this man wasn't just a guest denied a seat. He was a hero, and his presence outweighed any award on that stage. Then another voice rose, not from the stage, not from the VIP seats, but from the third row, near the aisle. An older woman, silver hair, tied neatly, stood, hands trembling but voice clear, sharp. "I'm Maggie Reynolds," she said, eyes red, as if a 20-year-old memory had just resurfaced. "I was the last person Jim Harper saved in that fire." The auditorium went still, as if the world held its breath. She pulled a creased photo from her purse, its edges worn, showing her and James in a hospital, his face half-bandaged, eyes still bright like an unquenched flame. She held it up for the room to see. "He carried me out as the ceiling crashed behind us. If not for Jim Harper, I wouldn't be here and my son wouldn't have a mom." Her voice broke, but she stood tall, as if repaying a debt she'd carried for 2 decades. Stifled sobs echoed somewhere. A man in the front row wiped his eyes, trying to hide it. Sarah felt tears roll down her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them. She looked at James, still quiet, eyes still on the floor, as if he didn't want anyone to see the scars the fire left on him. Maggie turned to the staffer, her voice no longer trembling. "You can't throw this man out," she said, each word like a hammer. "He gave us a second chance at life. You owe him more than a seat." Applause started, uneven but strong, like a small flame spreading. Sarah clapped, her heart pounding, as if witnessing something bigger than herself. But the real moment hadn't come. From the stage, a figure moved, not the MC, not a speaker. It was Ethan Harper in his award robe, hands gripping the mic. He didn't look at the audience, didn't glance at the gleaming trophy. He looked straight at his dad, standing silently in the corner. "I'm here because of my father," he said, voice shaking but firm, each word drawn from his heart. "Not for this award, not for the lights. Because my dad taught me heroes don't need glory." He paused, took a deep breath, then stepped off the stage, his strides quick but steady. The auditorium fell silent, a holy kind of quiet, like in churches or on battlefields. Ethan stopped before his father. Without hesitation, he slipped off his award robe and draped it over James's shoulders, gently, like a ritual. "This is your award, Dad," he said, voice choking. Then he hugged his dad, a hug not showy, but so tight it seemed the world couldn't pull them apart. The 4 firefighters behind them raised their hands in a slow, solemn salute, like soldiers honoring their commander. Mike Donovan stepped forward, pressing a Boise Fire Department commemorative coin into James's hand, engraved with, "Courage burns brighter than fire." James looked at the coin, said nothing, but Sarah swore. For a moment his shoulders lightened, as if a 20-year burden had been shared. The entire auditorium rose to its feet. Applause erupted, not the polite clapping of a ceremony, but a wave, powerful, heartfelt. The staffer bowed her head, slipping into the shadows, her fallen name tag unnoticed. Sarah clapped, tears streaming down her face. She looked at James, still standing, note in hand, his eyes now lifting, not for the lights, but to see his son. Because that was all he came for. Not glory, not a seat, but this moment when his son stood taller than any fire he'd ever faced. The Boise Convention Center auditorium sank into a heavy silence, as if the world held its breath. The scattered applause after Mike Donovan's declaration still echoed, but it wasn't enough to break the invisible wall of shame and awe enveloping the room. James Harper stood silent under the faint red glow of the exit sign, his son Ethan's handwritten note still in his hand, its edges soft from countless touches. The 4 retired firefighters stood tall like statues, their eyes locked on their old teammate. The staffer, her name tag now on the floor, backed away, face pale, as if realizing she'd ignited a fire she couldn't extinguish. Sarah Mitchell, seated mid-row, felt her heart pound. She looked at James, his eyes down, not seeking the spotlight, but his dignity like a smoldering flame, never fading. Then a new voice rose, not from the stage, not from the VIP seats, but from the third row, near the aisle. It was frail at first, but enough to make the entire auditorium turn. An older woman stood, silver hair tied neatly, hands trembling but eyes blazing. She wore a simple light blue dress, as if not wanting to stand out. But when she spoke, the room couldn't look away. "I'm Maggie Reynolds," she said, voice choked, as if a 20-year-old memory had surged from her heart's depths. "I was the last person Jim Harper saved in the Boise Mall fire." A sharp gasp sounded somewhere. Sarah felt her throat tighten. Maggie paused, taking a deep breath, her eyes red but tearless. She looked straight at James, as if they were the only two in the room. He carried me out as the ceiling crashed behind us. Flames licked at our feet, smoke so thick I couldn't breathe. But Jim didn't let go. If not for him, I wouldn't be here, and my son wouldn't have a mom. The auditorium fell silent, a sacred quiet, like in churches or on battlefields. Maggie turned to the staffer, now cowering in a corner, face ashen. "You can't throw this man out," she said, voice trembling but resolute, each word a hammer striking the room's indifference. "He gave us a second chance at life. You owe him more than a seat." She pulled a creased, yellowed photo from her purse, showing a younger Maggie on a hospital bed beside James, half his face bandaged white, his eyes still bright like an unquenched flame. She held it up, slowly, for the room to see. A stifled sob came from the front row. A man wiped his eyes, trying to hide it. Sarah felt tears roll down her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them. She just looked at James, still standing, eyes on the floor, as if he didn't want anyone to see the scars the fire left on him. Applause started, uneven but strong, like small sparks growing into a blaze. Sarah stood, her hands clapping slowly, as if to pull the room with her. A few others rose, then more, like a silent, unstoppable wave. The staffer bowed her head, sinking deeper into the shadows, as if wanting to vanish. The guards stood frozen, their radios now useless. But James didn't move. He didn't look up, didn't nod, as if the spotlight wasn't for him. Sarah knew, and Maggie knew, he hadn't come for recognition. He came for his son, for the note, for a promise he'd kept with his whole life. Then an unexpected moment struck, like a second bolt of lightning. From the fifth row, a middle-aged man stood, in a plain shirt, a small metal pin to his chest glinting under the lights. "I'm Tom Carter," he said, voice low but carrying far. "I was the paramedic who treated Jim Harper after that fire." The auditorium stilled again, as if unable to believe another witness had emerged. Tom pointed at James, his eyes bright with deep respect. "I saw him walk out of that building, his body charred, still holding Maggie tight. He collapsed right in front of me, but before he passed out, he said one thing. 'Is anyone else still in there?' A louder sob broke out somewhere. Sarah felt her heart stop. She looked at James, still head down, his shoulders trembling slightly, as if that memory still burned within him. Tom continued, his voice now choking. "I've seen a lot of heroes in my time, but none like Jim Harper. He didn't just save Maggie, didn't just save 8 people. He saved the whole fire team, the whole community, because he gave us a reason to believe in courage." He stopped, looking straight at the staffer, now nearly invisible in the corner. "And you dare try to throw him out?" Applause roared again, stronger, like a storm. Sarah clapped, tears streaming, unable to hold them back. She looked around, seeing strangers' faces now wiping eyes, standing, as if the entire auditorium was waking from a dream of indifference. But James still didn't look up. He stood there, note in hand, eyes locked on the floor, as if he didn't want the light to touch him. Sarah felt a profound respect, not just for what he'd done, but for how he chose silence, chose humility, even as the room rose for him. Maggie Reynolds stepped down from her row, hands trembling, and stopped before James. She said nothing, just placed a hand on his shoulder, gently, like a thank you without words. James looked up, just for a moment, and nodded, a small gesture heavy with a lifetime of sacrifice. The applause continued, but it wasn't ceremony clapping. It was the sound of gratitude, of awakening, of a community realizing they'd nearly lost a hero. Sarah looked at James, at Maggie, at the 4 firefighters still standing tall, and she knew this moment wasn't just about James Harper. It was about all the silent heroes who never asked for the spotlight, but deserve it more than anyone. And she knew the next moment, when Ethan Harper took the stage, would be one the auditorium would never forget. The Boise Convention Center auditorium hung in a sacred silence, as if the world held its breath to witness something far beyond an award ceremony. The applause after Maggie Reynolds' testimony still echoed, but it gave way to a profound stillness, like when a fire dies down to reveal embers still glowing. James Harper stood silent under the faint red glow of the exit sign, his son Ethan's handwritten note still in his hand, its edges soft, as if carrying a lifetime of sacrifice. Maggie, hands trembling, had just placed a hand on his shoulder, a wordless gesture heavier than any speech. The four retired firefighters stood tall, like loyal soldiers, their eyes fixed on their old teammate. Sarah Mitchell, mid-row, wiped tears quickly, but she couldn't look away from James. His dignity, his silence, was like a flame that didn't need a spotlight to burn bright. And then, the fateful moment came, not from the VIP seats, not from the MCs, but from the stage where Ethan Harper stood, his eyes blazing like his father's 20 years ago. Ethan, in his award robe, gripped the mic tightly, but he didn't look at the audience or the gleaming trophy on the table. He looked straight at his dad, standing silently in the corner, as if the world held only them. "I'm here because of my father," he said, voice shaking but resolute, each word drawn from his heart. "Not for this award, not for the stage lights. Because my dad taught me that heroes don't need glory. They just need to do what's right, even when no one's watching." The auditorium stilled, a heavy silence like before a storm. Ethan took a deep breath, his hands clenching the mic until his knuckles whitened. "Every morning before I left for school, my dad said one thing: stand tall, live true, and never let the fire in you die. I'm here because of him, because of that fire." He stepped off the stage, his strides quick but steady, robe fluttering like a flag. The auditorium held its breath, as if no one dared break the moment. Ethan stopped before his father, his eyes shining, not with the pride of an award winner, but with his son's love. Without hesitation, he slipped off his award robe and draped it over James's shoulders, gently, like a sacred ritual. "This is your award, Dad," he said, voice choking, each word ringing like a vow. Then he hugged his dad, a hug so tight it seemed the world couldn't pull them apart. James, for the first time, looked up, his eyes meeting his son's, and for a fleeting moment, Sarah swore she saw a spark in his gaze. Not pride, but a deep peace, as if every fire he'd faced had finally faded. The auditorium fell silent, a holy quiet, like in churches or on battlefields. The four firefighters behind James raised their hands in a slow, solemn salute, like soldiers honoring their commander. Mike Donovan, their leader, stepped forward, holding a Boise Fire Department commemorative coin, glinting under the lights. He pressed it into James's hand, voice low but clear. "Courage burns brighter than fire," he said, pointing to the engraved words. "This isn't an award, Jim. It's a reminder." James looked at the coin, said nothing, but Sarah saw his shoulders tremble slightly, as if a 20-year burden had been shared, not lifted, but placed in the hands of those who knew him best. The entire auditorium rose to its feet. Applause erupted, not the polite clapping of a ceremony, but a wave, powerful, heartfelt, like fire spreading across a dry field. Sarah clapped, tears streaming down her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them. She looked at James, at Ethan, at the four firefighters, and felt a sacredness she'd never known. The event staffer, now retreated into the shadows, bowed her head, as if wanting to vanish from this moment. The guard stood frozen, their radios useless. But the true moment, the one the auditorium would never forget, came from another unexpected act, like a final bolt of lightning tearing through the night. From a fourth row, a young girl, no older than 18, stepped forward. She wore a simple sweater, hair tied high, eyes red. "I'm Emily Carter," she said, voice trembling but clear, as if she'd waited her whole life to say these words. "Mr. Harper didn't just save Maggie. He saved my whole family." The auditorium stilled again, as if unable to believe another story emerged. Emily pointed at James, her hand shaking. "My mom, Maggie Reynolds, told me about him every night. But she didn't tell me that, after carrying her out, he went back into the building, even as the flames swallowed the entrance. He saved my grandpa, who I never met, but I carry his name. A loud sob broke out somewhere. Sarah felt her heart stop. She looked at James, still standing, Ethan's robe on his shoulders, his eyes down again, as if he didn't want the light to touch him. Emily stepped closer, holding a small leather bracelet, a tiny metal piece glinting. "This was my grandpa's old badge," she said, voice choking. "My mom kept it to remind me of you, of the man who gave me a family." She placed the bracelet in James's hand, gently, like a gift beyond measure. James looked up, longer this time, and nodded, a small gesture heavy with a lifetime. Emily hugged him, a quick but tight embrace, then stepped back, tears streaming, but a smile brighter than any light in the room. Applause roared again, stronger, like an unstoppable storm. Sarah stood frozen, her chest bursting. She looked around, seeing strangers wiping eyes, standing, as if the auditorium was repaying a debt they didn't know they owed. James said nothing. He stood there, robe on his shoulders, coin in his left hand, bracelet in his right, and the note still close to his heart. He didn't seek the light, didn't seek glory, but the light found him, and the entire auditorium rose for him. Sarah knew this moment wasn't just about James Harper. It was about all the silent heroes who never ask, but deserve more than anyone. And she knew, when Ethan led his father to the front row, that moment would be etched in Boise's heart forever. The Boise Convention Center auditorium still pulsed with applause, but it was no longer storm. It had become a steady, heartfelt rhythm, like the heartbeat of a city waking up. James Harper, with Ethan's award robe still on his shoulders, the Boise Fire Department coin in his left hand, and Emily Carter's leather bracelet in his right, finally stepped to the VIP front row. Ethan walked beside him, not as an award winner, but as a son guiding his father to where he belonged. The handwritten note, its edges soft from countless touches, stayed close to James's heart, a reminder of why he came. Sarah Mitchell, standing mid-row, couldn't look away. Tears had dried on her cheeks, but her heart still pounded, as if she'd witnessed something that didn't just change this night, but change how she saw the world. James sat down, front row, center, where minutes ago he'd been denied. Ethan sat beside him, his eyes shining, not with pride, but with a deep peace, as if he'd repaid a debt he'd carried since childhood. The auditorium remained standing, applause fading, but no one rushed to leave. They looked at James, no longer a stranger in a worn firefighter's jacket, but a hero they'd nearly lost. The event staffer, now gone into the shadows, was no longer the focus. The guard stood in a corner, radios silent, as if they too wanted to blend into this moment. But the real moment, the one Boise would never forget, began when strangers stepped forward. A young girl, no older than 16, ponytail swinging, stepped out from a back row. She wore a plain hoodie, hands trembling as she stopped before James. "Thank you, sir," she said, voice small but clear, as if she'd rehearsed it her whole life. "My mom was one of the 8 you saved. She tells me about you every year on her birthday." She paused, took a deep breath, and placed a small earring in James's hand, glinting under the lights. "This is what my mom wore that day. She wants you to have it." James looked up, his eyes meeting the girl's, and he nodded, a small gesture heavy with a lifetime. The girl stepped back, tears streaming, but her smile outshone every light in the room. Then an older man, salt and pepper hair, stepped forward. He wore an old blazer, a small Idaho Fire Association badge pinned to his chest. "I'm Frank," he said, voice low, each word carrying memory. "I was on another fire crew that day. I saw you run into that building, Jim. I saw you walk out, charred but still standing tall." He paused, eyes red. "We never thank you enough." He pulled an old handkerchief from his pocket, embroidered with Boise FD, and placed it in James's hand. "This is for my crew. Keep it, hero." James said nothing, just nodded, but Sarah swore she saw his shoulders tremble, as if each gift, each word, was gently easing a burden he'd carried for 20 years. A middle-aged woman in a neat business dress stepped up next. She didn't say much, just took James's hand gently and whispered, "My son's a firefighter now, because of you. Thank you." She stepped back, wiping tears quickly. Then a boy, no older than 10, ran forward, holding a scribbled drawing of a firefighter in flames. "I drew this for you," he said, voice high and clear. James bent down, took the drawing, and for the first time, Sarah saw a faint smile cross his lips, small but real, like a spark flaring in the dark. The applause had stopped, but the auditorium was no longer a ceremony. It had become a place of gratitude, of debts repaid, of stories retold. Sarah stood there, her chest bursting. She looked at James, at Ethan, at the strangers no longer strangers, and knew this moment wasn't just about one hero. It was about a community realizing they'd nearly forgotten the man who gave them reason to be proud. A camera, if there was one, would pan slowly over James's hand, where the coin gleamed with courage burns brighter than fire. Over the leather bracelet, the scribbled drawing, and finally, the handwritten note, still close to his heart. But the final moment, the one that made the auditorium hold its breath, came from someone no one expected. An older man, limping, leaning on a cane, stepped out from the back row. He wore an old coat, but a silver medal on his chest shone like a star. "I'm Walter Hayes," he said, voice weak, but carrying far, as if he'd waited a lifetime for these words. "I was the shift chief the night of the Boise Mall fire. I ordered Jim not to go into that building. It was too dangerous." But he didn't listen. He paused, eyes red, looking straight at James. "He saved my crew, saved Maggie, saved everyone. When he walked out, charred, I thought he wouldn't make it. But he did, and he never asked for anything." A loud sob broke out somewhere. Sarah felt her heart stop. Walter stepped closer, hands trembling, and pulled an old badge from his pocket, its brass edges tarnished. "This is my badge," he said. "I kept it to remind me of you, Jim. Now it's yours." He placed it in James's hand, then, with all his strength, raised a slow, solemn salute, like a soldier repaying his commander. James looked up, his eyes meeting Walter's, and this time, he didn't look down. He nodded gently and placed a hand on Walter's shoulder, as if saying no debt needed repaying. The auditorium stilled, then applause roared again, unstoppable like a storm. James Harper didn't come to be honored. He came for his son, for the handwritten note, for a promise he'd kept with his whole life. But as he left, an entire city stood for him. Not because he asked, but because he deserved it. Sarah stood there, feeling a sacredness she'd never known. She looked at James, at Ethan, at the small gifts in his hands, and knew this story would live in Boise's heart forever. A voice echoed in her mind, like a reminder, to hear more stories of courage and gratitude. Don't let the silent heroes be forgotten.